that it? We're good to go? Yep. Okay. Right. It's lovely to see everybody in person today. It's really nice to see that you have legs and not just heads in boxes. So you're very, very welcome to this in-person meeting of the Climate Emergency Advisory Committee. So we're live streaming the meeting, so we're good to go. And I'm going to start by asking members of the committee to introduce themselves. My name's Katie Dye. I chair this committee and I'm a councillor for Killinbeck and Seacroft. Should we go this way around?
Good afternoon, Councillor Eleanor Thompson, representing Guiseley and Rawdon Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor John Tudor, representing Killinbeck and Seacroft Ward.
Good afternoon, everyone. Councillor Paul Truswell, representing Middleton and Belle Isle.
Good afternoon, everyone. Councillor Jordan Bowden, representing Roundhay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Councillor Marmishstad, representing the Moortown and Meanwood Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Peter Carlisle, Carley and Farsley Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Al Garthwaite, representing Headingley and Hyde Park Ward.
Should we do, other members of the committee first?
Good afternoon, Councillor Oliver Newton, Morley South Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Conrad Hartbrook, Rothwell Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Barry Anderson, Adlan Wharfdale Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Ian Buckley, Paul Woodley Ward.
Thank you very much. So now shall we ask officers to introduce themselves? Shall we start this side?
Hi, Polly Kirk, Chief Officer, Sustainable Energy and Air Quality.
Assi Sivapalan, I'm the clerk to this committee.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Julie Longworth and I'm the Interim Director of Children and Families.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chad Newton. I'm Sustainable Energy and Air Quality Team, and I'm the Senior Policy and Communications Officer.
Good afternoon, Rachel Wainwright, and I'm Policy Officer in the Sustainable Energy and Air Quality Team.
Thank you, and you're all very welcome to today's meeting. So shall we start, Cassie, with the first three items which you're going to take charge of?
Under agenda item number 1, there are no appeals against refusal of inspection of documents. Under agenda item 2, there's no exempt information. And under agenda item 3, there are no late items. Under agenda item 4, are there any declarations of interest? No. And under agenda item 5, we've had apologies from Councillor Wadsworth.
Okay, thank you very much. So next item on the agenda is the minutes, and we have 2 sets of minutes to approve at this meeting because we have the last in-person set of minutes, which you'll need good memories for because it was on the 23rd of June. So I'm assuming that you've got copies in front of you, and we'll go through them a page at a time, and then anybody who's got any comments or anything that they want to add can do so. So the first page in your pack is page 5. Next one is page 6. So can I just add 2 things from that page? So the first one is you might remember that Climate Action Leeds were one of our attendees at the open forum, and we encouraged them to bring future climate action groups to the open forum for other meetings. I know Climate Action Seacroft have been, and we've had 1 or 2 others, but that's an open invitation. So if you have any climate groups that are working in your wards, they're very, very welcome to come along, and it'd be really good to see them and hear what they're doing. And then the second thing I wanted to say on that page is just a reminder that anybody who's a councillor can join the SEAC working groups, and I would really appreciate your encouragement to ask people to come along. And then the final one that and the final one is that we have been inviting each directorate to come along to our meetings. So that's page 6 from me. Page 7, anybody, any comments or amendments on page 7? Page 8. So I did spot one thing on page 8, that in the last but one paragraph, it said that further work for local plan update 2 was to follow in 2002. So I think that needs amending. Anything on page 9? Page 10? Okay, so let's approve those as minutes for that meeting. And then now let's go on to the last SEAC we had online, which was in January. So that starts on page 11 in your packs. Anything on page 11? Okay, so just 2 updates from me in that the open forum item, the first one, was discussed at the working group, and I'll update on that later. And I know Rachel has also followed that up with the planning team, and Rachel's also followed up the second one, and we have written to Sports England to express our concerns. Anything on page 12? Okay, page 13. Page 14. 15. 16. Okay, so those minutes are approved as well. Thank you very much, everybody. So that takes us on to item 7, and I think we have 2 submissions for open forum this week. Is that correct, Rachel? So shall I hand over to you?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. We've got the commitment, and we've also got a video from Guiseley Primary School. So I can see that we do have representatives from the commitment currently on the call. So if you would like, Chair, I can obviously pass over to those to start with their open forum, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. We're really pleased to be here. We do have heads, as you can see, and I can assure you we've got legs as well. We'd like to be in the room with you where you will have legs. On the screen you have Leela, who is one of our political engagement specialists, and me, William, co-director of the commitment. The commitment is a charity with the sole objective of speeding up government action on the climate and biodiversity. We're quite near the beginning of our journey, but we've had some really encouraging early results. A commitment is something that a voter makes, which is an undertaking to vote only for politicians, and often this can mean politicians broadly as well as individually, to vote only for politicians who will work for urgent action on the climate and biodiversity. That is a formal, enduring undertaking, but it is supplemented by a personal statement of why it is someone is making this commitment to vote in such a specific way. And that people say in their own words, often with pictures and sometimes even a video or whatever, they say why they're doing this. And these statements of commitment are very personal, often very emotional, and they're much more than just numbers. And so, for example, I mean, the commitment is very, very different from a petition. We take commitments to the politicians specifically who these voters vote for. We're providing, and I'm sure nearly all the members, probably all the members of this committee fall into this category. We provide further evidence for politicians and encouragement for them, for those who are already committed to more urgent action on the climate and nature. And we give them the evidence they need to go and persuade their perhaps more sceptical peers that there is serious voter demand for urgent change. And for those who aren't yet completely committed to that change, we give them persuasion in the form of showing them how many of their voters care about these things, persuasion that they could do more and maybe should change their priorities. In the case of Leeds, and Leela's going to share her screen, we can show you what we have in Leeds, which is what we have so far. This number will rise considerably from here if all goes to plan. So here is a report which is tailored to Leeds. Sorry, Leela, can you just go back to the first page? So here it is, a powerful reason for you as politicians to act. And this is specifically about Leeds. So if we go to the next page and the next, I've covered that one. Here is a map of the 338 commitments that we so far have from voters in Leeds. And you can see how widely distributed they are. Very often people looking at these maps say, I didn't expect people from that particular area to be represented as much as they are. And of course, you'll know this area very much better than we do, and whether that comment applies to you. And then if we keep going, and again, I think we can skip that page. And then here are some specific commitments that people have made. In the case of Linda here, she's obviously given us a photograph as well. Otherwise, you can see, and if we skip to the next page, I'll at the bottom there, on the right-hand side, Catherine, I'll let you read it for yourselves. Here's a Leeds specific comment from a Leeds voter. It's surprising how many people make commitments that are very almost global in their slant, if you like. It's relatively rare, global and thematic, relatively rare that they're local, but in this case, here is one that's local. And then Graham in the bottom left, some people write really short commitments like this, but very moving, as this one is. And then if we keep going, Leela.
We read all commitments in Leeds, and there were some topics which came up over and over again in the commitments. So one of these was future generations, because we have seen an overwhelming focus on the well-being of future generations, and people really want their children and grandchildren to inherit a healthy planet. We also saw that many cared about the protection and restoration of nature, and the commitments really showed that people valued their connection to the natural world. And lastly, many people focus on air quality and public health, and they really saw how environmental issues were really interlinked with their health in a city. And in this next page, we brought to you some actions you could take in relation to these priorities which people from Leeds articulated. So because we know that resilience to climate change is crucial for the well-being of future generations, we would like to recommend that you set a timely target for the publication of the Climate and Resilience Adaptation Plan. In relation to nature restoration, we would like to ask you to develop or refresh a cross-departmental strategy for nature recovery and climate resilience. And you can use the guidance from the UK Green Building Council for local authorities. And lastly, in relation to public health, we would like to recommend that you incorporate the need to reduce cars into your local plans. And again, we linked the recommendations of Friends of the Earth for the different measures you could take in this regard. And here we come to the end of our presentation. So I would like to thank you all. We will send to you all this report, and you can take a look at all the commitments that were made in Leeds. And I think we would like to hear about your questions or thoughts about what we brought to you today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think we'd be really keen as a committee to share with you the things that we're doing in Leeds. And if you can send that report via Rachel, probably, so that we can all get a copy of it. It'd be good to see what we can do to support you, particularly to have a close look at the section where you've said how we can support you. And then we as a committee can look through that as both individuals and as a committee and respond to you. And it would also be good to have an update as more people in Leeds make commitments. So, as that number increases, it would be good to see how and why and what people are saying. Does anybody have any comments?
Thanks to Councillor Anderson, we were able to welcome members of the commitment to our recent community committee, and I would recommend others do so as well, because it's a really good way to get a very local engagement with them.
I think that's a really good idea, and we can share that amongst our community committees across the city. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for attending, and no doubt we will be in touch with you in the near future. Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, Rachel, thank you for that. So our second one, please.
Thank you, Chair. So the next open forum submission is from Guysley Primary School. So I'll just share my screen a moment through my laptop, so it won't be a minute.
Primary's Eco Warriors. And we, alongside Marcus in the Guysley Community Foundation, are asking. Hi, we're Guysley Primary's Eco Warriors. And we, alongside Marcus in the Guysley Community Foundation, are asking for your help. And all the other schools. We need wildflower seeds to attract bees, butterflies, and other wildlife to attract to our school. We will see wildlife in our school, but there's only so much we can do on our own. Please help us and all your schools to send us wildflower seeds.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. That was absolutely super. That was brilliant. So thank you so much, Guysley Primary School, for taking time to make that video and sharing it with us. It's absolutely fabulous. And your specific request was for us to find ways of sending wildflower seeds to you. I think that's an absolutely super request. Does anybody have any comments or suggestions of how we can get more seeds to Guysley Primary School?
So that's something we as ward members can certainly look at. They would like you to do the same for other schools. So an open invitation to engage with your local primary schools and do the same for them if you'd like to.
Fabulous. What a brilliant suggestion. So Guysley Primary School, you now have a commitment for some what's called mice money for ward members to send to your school to get wildflower seeds. And can I encourage every other member of the committee to engage with their local primary schools and do the same? It's certainly something that we will be looking to do in Killingbeck and Seacroft. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Rachel. Is that it for the open forum?
It is, Chair. Yes.
Super. Thank you. So that brings us on to item 8, which is working groups update. So we've got 4 working groups that met since the last full SEAC meeting. And I'm going to take updates in the order in which they met. So shall we start with Councillor Carlill for Economy and Finance, please?
Thanks, Chair. Certainly, yeah, we had a meeting early February with a couple of items on the agenda. The first was around social value in procurement. There was a presentation on the social value approach, I guess it is, of the council, the weight given to social value in contracts, and the move towards local monitoring of social value and in the categories that we're working towards, so that when companies do procure for services, there are the set categories in terms of improvements for the climate that we can ask them to support with on those contracts. In terms of the discussions, really, the main things members asked about, we had discussion hearing about obviously encouraging local purchase of items when we're tendering out for consumables and what have you. There was a bit of a discussion about how we could try and encourage local manufacture of them as well. So obviously buying something local, but hopefully from a business that was reasonably local as well, to cut down on those air miles, but also to get other value out of that procurement. There was a key steer that members wanted any offsetting of environmental measures to be a very last resort in terms of looking at the accreditations that procurers, suppliers would have. And then there was a bit of a discussion around the minimum weighting of social value and how we could look at different categories perhaps of procurement and see whether there were some areas where that could be increased and we could get more from, rather than a one size fits all. The second item we touched on was Green Home Finance, the Green Home Finance Accelerator project, which focuses on the able to pay market and getting options for home retrofit for private homes among those who may be able to pay for those benefits. I think the key thing we discussed was the usefulness of having a one-stop shop for information around retrofits, whether that's for people who are benefiting from any finance that the council and partners are able to work towards, or for people who may be looking to finance it themselves but really need that trusted information that hopefully they'll feel the local authority could provide. And then there was a discussion of a range of finance models and opportunities that may be part of it. We noted that if we have a next meeting, we'll try and focus that around the climate bonds if the timescale fits with that.
Thank you very much. Anybody want to add anything to that update? Okay, thank you. So can we then go on to Councillor Anderson for biodiversity, food and waste, please?
Thank you, Chair. We had a meeting on the 6th of March. The principal item was discussion around the food strategy. I'm not going to go into great detail on it because hopefully you've all read it in the report already, so we don't need to go through it. But what was interesting is the consultation started in October. We've now had the feedback, and as a result of that, some of the language that was used has been the tone has been changed to make it a lot more understandable, which I think we would all applaud, because what we're trying to do is to get in touch with our residents rather than them to get in touch with us. We need to get the message out to them and explain what's happening. They also, as a result of the feedback, they reprioritised and reordered some of the objectives as well to try and make them more fitting in with what was happening. And the things that came up, allotments, they felt that more needed to be done to discuss allotments and where the space is coming from, and also the waste that comes from food packaging. And then the final thing was cultural food, as to how we can make it more widely available and also to celebrate the cultural food. The other issues that we need to look into, however, is land for allotments. This is maybe more something that needs to go to the planning subgroup, because land is scarce. And if we're going to put more money in for allotments, it's going to come from some allocation of some description. Now, should it come from the housing allocation, the employment allocation, the green space allocation? Something's got to give. So we need to get that point across. And also, when it comes to green space use as well, what would be the best use of the green space? Is it better to have it for food production and producing food as close as you can to the point of consumption, or should we continue to import food in? We've got these debates still to have, but the important thing is we need to work with the 3 exec members that have responsibility in this area, which is Councillor Hayden, Councillor Arif and Councillor Rafiq, because on the waste strategy side of things, there is a proposal for a food collection pilot to come around, and there's also one for glass potentially coming around as well. Now, I've certainly not been told yet where it's going, but that'll be interesting to see where it is and what sort of issues come up with it. And the other thing is what's going to happen about glass collection, because in Scotland, their experience hasn't exactly been smooth in terms of their bottle reclaim. There's issues, I think, that have come out of that. And let's hope we in England don't, as Scott's saying that, isn't that great? We in England don't suffer from the same teething problems that they've had. And then the other thing that we're going to start doing is we get access to a number of consultation documents that are coming from the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, either through Polly or Rachel also gets a hold of them as well. And we're starting now to develop responses on behalf of the committee, which usually gets sent to everybody electronically, and you're asked to whether or not to approve them. And that's probably it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else want to add anything to that update? Okay, I'll move on to infrastructure, planning and buildings, which is me, and we met on the 8th of March. So just 4 key things really to update you on from that meeting. We looked at the consultation to the local plan update, and we were really pleased to see that 90% of the responses to that consultation were in support. The next step, I believe, for that is it's going to the development plans panel in April. And as a kind of a sub discussion to that, we discussed the open forum submission that I mentioned previously. And I think the idea that came out of that was that as a council, we're kind of limited at the moment in the influence we can have in those kind of discussions. But if we get the local plan update adopted, then that'll give us much more capacity to require more from developers in terms of their infrastructure. So clearly, as far as we're concerned as a committee, that is a really important thing. We then discussed the consultation on adaptation reporting from local authorities. We went through the questions and agreed on what we thought was going to be useful, and that's going to get fed back. And then thank you to Rachel, who came back to us with more detail on the improving boiler standard consultation. We discussed those questions as well. And I think, Rachel, you've sent that off or are sending that off, is that correct? So super. So thanks, Rachel, for all your work on that. That's really appreciated. So that's infrastructure. Anybody else want to add into that one?
Those of us who are on planning will get advised about this, but there's been 2 plans have gone forward on the same basis as we are proposing. One was accepted by an inspector, the other one, an inspector threw it out. So even though we could potentially have the best thing that's ever been invented, if the inspector doesn't agree, having to go back. So one of the councils is having to go back to start again to try to see if they can get something that would be, because which inspector are we going to get? And that could be one of the, so that would then throw out a lot of the initiatives that we all agree are vitally important, could be delayed, because developers are then going to say, oh, you don't have to comply with this now because they're not complying with it. And I think it was Lancaster, I think, had the problems. So it's just to be aware of that from the planning perspective, that we need to get, hopefully, not that our planning officers are going to do anything wrong, it's just the inspectors have made adverse comments about one of them.
Thank you. I think that's certainly something to keep an eye on. That'd be a really important point moving forwards. Okay, so the last one is community and business engagement. Councillor Shazad chairs that, but I chaired it at the last meeting, so I'm going to update on that. And I just want to thank the representatives from Greenwood who came along. It was an absolutely fascinating discussion. And they're a community group that works with businesses and organisations in Meanwood to encourage climate action. They went through essentially the successes that they'd had with the work that they've been doing. They included some success in terms of recycling and single-use plastic use, and they talked about cardboard now being better recycled. Another success was linking businesses to the council and the support that was available. In terms of barriers, they talked a lot about the precarious situation that a lot of businesses are in and how situations arise where there's matched funding to be had, but if they can't raise the match, then they miss out on that funding. And then they talked about opportunities, that they found it was really good to get business engagement, and they thought the community was thriving more because of the work they'd done. And obviously opportunities to transfer what they've learnt across to other communities in Leeds. And I thought that for me was my biggest takeaway, that we can all learn from that and we can bring that work to our own communities. And it's certainly something that I've already raised with our group Climate Action Seacroft, in terms of meeting up with Greenwood and looking at how we can transfer the work that they've done to us. And it was certainly something I would encourage other members of the committee to do, because it raised some really interesting opportunities. And then in terms of the grants and match funding, we wondered whether that was something that the finance working group could look at and see if we could look at more effective ways of supporting businesses who are keen to take climate action, but financially not in a position to avail themselves of all the support that's available. So I think that's further work that we can do on that. And then we discussed the idea of using CMI schemes possibly to do the same thing. So I think that's two things for the finance group to pick up on that. I think that's probably it, unless anybody who else was at that meeting can add anything. Okay, so just to bring this section to a close, can I just finish by saying thank you to the chairs of the committees who I couldn't have run those without you, and it's really super all the work you've done. You've been very committed and you worked really hard, and I do appreciate that. And exactly the same thanks to all the officers who've supported those committees. I think they've done some really good work this year, and we've got plenty more to be getting on with next year. So thank you very much. And we'll now move on to item number 9, which is our director update. So you'll know that we've invited all the directorates over the year to come and attend our committee and update us on their progress towards net zero. And I'm pleased to welcome Julie from Children and Families today.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to really sort of cover 4 key areas of work this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about the voice of children and young people, and really how we have enabled children and young people to share their views on the climate emergency and then support them to take action. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done within our children's social work, early help and residential services. Talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we've done in our learning services, and then I'll finish off by just talking about resources. So in relation to children and young people's voices, in February 2020, the Leeds Youth Summit on Climate for Students from Leeds secondary education settings was attended by around 114 students and members of staff, and that was from across 17 Leeds secondary schools and settings. The students participated in question and answer sessions with elected members and senior decision makers. The outcomes from the summit led to the creation of a young person's toolkit. The toolkit's been widely shared online and also through a flyer. And it really sets out actions that children can take at home, in school and in their community. It also gives them some tips in terms of how they can use their voice to speak up for the environment. And what we know about children and young people, and this comes directly from their feedback, is that where they're enabled to take action, they feel that they can have that sense of control. Because actually what we do know, again, directly from children and young people, is the impact that I suppose the concern, anxiety around the climate emergency can have on their mental health. But actually when they feel that they're being empowered and supported to take action, that really does have a positive impact on that overall. We had the Get Creative for Climate Environment project in, that was the autumn of 2020. All primary schools were invited to produce a short video on a presentation, Climate Action. There were 3 winning entries, and they were premiered at the Climate Emergency Advisory Committee again in January 21. The outcome really was sharing those sort of winning entries, but also sharing the Leeds Climate Action Route Map with schools. And that was to promote and support the school participation in the COP26. The Climate Action Route Map, or the CARM as it's referred to, really supports school leaders in helping to provide high quality climate education. And it's really focused around 10 steps that they can take as leaders to establish good practice. It includes opportunities to, I suppose, just have greater pupil participation, and again, to enable the voice of children and young people to be heard. Leeds Youth Council were also members of the working group that developed the Ripple Effect film, which was shown at COP26, and that was in November 21. It really emphasised the unique experience of children of their age group. The documentary featured interviews, vlogs, and mini films, all created by young people, and also a narrative. Water-related impacts were a key theme. So in the UK, as an example, children talking about their experience of floods, whilst in South Africa, children were talking about their experiences of water shortages and the major impacts of that on them. Cutting across all of the experiences really, again, was the deep concern that young people shared and felt about their future, about their families, and about the destruction of the natural environment and climate justice. So again, I think just highlighting the impact, on young people's mental health, social, emotional mental health. In July 2022, for the 10th birthday of Child Friendly Leeds, we refreshed our child friendly wishes. We used data from citywide surveys, from consultations, from youth ballots, from themes that came about through youth elections. And really that it reflected 3 years worth of participation and feedback from more than 80,000 young people across the city. As a result of that, we have now got number 5 of the Leeds Child Friendly Wishes, which is everyone takes more action to protect the environment from climate change. We've also refreshed, we're just in the process of finalising the refresh of the Children and Young People's Plan. And that's the plan that any organisation working or looking to support children and families in the city signs up to. And we have in the most recent refresh, we've added an additional priority, and that priority reflects the wish that I've just read out. So again, for everyone to take more action to protect the environment from climate change. In Leeds, as colleagues are aware, we have 10 community youth summit events. They take place over the year, and again take place between children, young people, locally elected members. The wishes have been shared and will be shared at these events over the next 12 months. And that enables children and young people, again, to influence how youth activity funds could be spent within their local area. So as an example, the Inner Northwest Summit on the 12th of January of this year was focused specifically on climate, with 6 Leeds primary schools invited to contribute to letting decision makers know, again, how important to them it is to work together. Moving on to some of the work that we've done within children's social work, within early help, and also within our children looked after services. So really have climate emergency now as a key focus for individual team meetings. So it's a regular agenda item for staff. And that, I suppose, gives the opportunity for colleagues to think about action that they can take, both within the workplace, but also just reflecting, again, within their own personal lives, to support, to be more environmentally friendly. We're really increasing, where we can and where it's appropriate to do so, hybrid working. So, as an example, all teams within the West and the Northwest and within our Child Health and Disability Service have now a hybrid working model. The other thing that we've looked at as well is introducing more electronic pool cars. So we've currently got 3, which are available to our children's social work service, and we're really wanting to build on that. We've got a real focus on community hubs. So our early help practitioners are now working from community hubs, and again, looking at how we reduce travel for the workforce across the city, but also how we reduce travel for children, young peoples and families, and how we ensure that our services are more accessible for them. There's something there as well about how we're utilising our resources, and those are shared buildings, as an example, assets that we can share with other partners. In terms of our residential children's homes, so in our secure children's homes, so that's Adelbeck, we have reduced the use of single-use plastics by 75%. We've reduced food waste, and we've upgraded the lighting of LEDs and have plans to expand our solar panel system, which will then cover 80% of the roof at Adelbeck. We've got a real focus on our new build. So we're currently building a new children's home for children with complex needs. And as an example, we now have ground source heat pumps rather than boilers in the new builds. There's a number of programs underway looking at window installation, lighting and roofing improvements across all of the other homes. So moving on to learning and some of the work that we've been doing in the learning services. Again, just that real focus on many meetings now being held virtually. So again, reducing the carbon footprint across our learning services. A particular example of that is head teachers meetings, which now in the main are held virtually. There's been an increased focus on web-based online training. So again, really making that training more accessible and less costly in terms of that carbon footprint. Leeds for Learning particularly reduced the need for paper-based packs that were previously distributed as a matter of course. And a good example of this is the new Head Teachers Toolkit. This is now accessed as an electronic toolkit. And again, that's really helpful just in terms of it being more easy to update and to keep sort of live and relevant. From July 2019, the My Health, My School survey, it had some additional questions. It included climate change as a response to questions about what pupils worried about most, also how much useful information and learning that they have had to help understand climate change, and also whether pupils would know where to get help or advice in relation to climate change. The response to the first 2 questions has sort of been relatively similar. However, the response to the last question, we've seen an 11% decrease in that, in terms of where children, or do children know where they can get that advice and information from. So as an example, the climate action route map was a development in direct response to the fact that children were sort of saying, actually, we're not really sure where we can get that information. So again, having that initiative developed through schools, I suppose just shows you specific action that we're taking in relation to specific feedback that we're getting from children and young people. We also have the Leeds School Uniform Exchange. That's being run now with Leeds City Council and Leeds Community Foundation. And they've funded the Zero Waste Leeds to bring a uniform rescue scheme to the city. So the scheme reduces uniforms sent to waste, and it also reduces the stigma of perhaps wearing secondhand clothes, which historically there might have been within the city. I'm just going to move on then finally to resources, because I know I'm on a short time scale this afternoon. So we have been match funding the range of bids for solar panels, boilers and replacements in schools. This year we've allocated over 1 million to match fund schemes of this type to reduce the carbon emission in schools. For this coming year, the Asset and Access team have top sliced 1.2 million of the 6 million school conditional allocation grant that's received from the DFE to contribute to match funding required for new decarbonisation schemes. So again, once again, supporting a number of schools to become carbon neutral. There's been several initiatives, both with council buildings and encouraging schools to reduce energy and water usage. So again, looking at schools, looking at our council buildings during holiday periods where we have been able to have some of those closures. The Asset and Access team will imminently be releasing new premises development plans and guidance to help schools manage their building and their estate priorities. And it will also point them to guidance on how to save energy and also how to invest in an infrastructure to support the reduction of CO2 emissions. We're doing a lot of work, continue to do a lot of work within the Children's Transport and Learning Inclusion Service. And that's really with a focus on independent travel training. So again, particularly supporting children who perhaps have complex needs or disability to be able to use independent travel as opposed to private hire. We've had the Bike to School scheme, and that was introduced in 2020. This scheme was available to children who were starting year 10 and 11, who received a free school bus pass and lived under 4 miles from the school. Instead of a free bus pass, those children were provided with a bicycle and also safety equipment. The Children's Transport Service partnered with the Bike College, who helped restore the bicycles. And maybe just finish finally with commissioning. And just to say, obviously, we do have a corporate approach to commissioning, whereby we must, and it's a responsibility, it's a duty for us to identify a commitment from potential providers in regards to social value, and that it's got to be monitored in relation to the climate and environmental impacts that their work will have through any commissioning process. So I know there's covered a lot there, but I'll stop now. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Julie. You have covered a lot and a really kind of diverse presentation in terms of the things you've mentioned. Can I have an indication of people who would like to speak? We'll start with Councillor Trustwell.
Yes, Chair, thank you. First of all, reinforce your thanks to Julie for what is a very comprehensive report. I only wish we could have had it in writing prior to the meeting rather than having to try and absorb it on the hoof and ask questions. It was really refreshing to hear the very positive steps that are being taken around education, around awareness raising, and also empowering young people's voice on their concerns about the environment. Some of the questions I was going to ask in more detail have been answered as Julie went on about what the department is doing in terms of its physical assets. So she mentioned some of the work that's been done in terms of the construction of new facilities, which hopefully will be carbon neutral per se. But just to kind of drill down a little bit into other facilities like children's homes, family centres, office space, has there been a departmental audit of those facilities to identify what improvements could be made and what the costs would be and how you might prioritise that investment over time to get the biggest bang for our buck? And right at the end, there was another question I was going to ask about commissioning and procurement, but again, that's been answered in terms of achieving the council's aims and climate emergency and social value. But I'm just wondering, because I think it's a question we need to ask of all departments, do they know the state of their built environment? Have they audited that? And this includes schools as well, which I think is probably a separate exercise given its enormity, and what might be identified as priorities for the maximum carbon saving and what that's likely to cost. Because we are reminded from time to time that we do ask a lot of government, but we need to quantify precisely what would help to address the challenges that we face in this and many other areas.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments and that question. I'm going to bring Polly in, who's probably be able to speak to you quite a lot about the things you.
So because of the way that we do our estate management, it isn't done by each of the directorates, it's done in a central way. So we work across all the different directorates, but ultimately we would look at that corporately in terms of the different buildings. And that's why we bring in things like the public sector decarbonisation funding and look where we can best use it. So it wouldn't be, I suppose, Children's that would do that audit of assets. Children's have responsibility for the school side, but any of the sort of children's centres and things like that, we would work with colleagues in Children to look at how we best use our planned maintenance budget, where we can bring in additional grant funding. And earlier this morning in an audit committee was saying fundamentally we can look to do sort of investor save when it's things like controls, when it's LED lighting, solar panels, things like that, there tends to be a business case. The bit that's still quite challenging is when you're looking at decarbonisation of heat. And that, I suppose, is principally why government is still offering a grant for that. And that's why we obviously actively pursue those grants, because what government's trying to do is really boost that marketplace so that actually the prices start to come down and you start to get a cost parity. So there's not such a big challenge in terms of, coming off gas. So that's where we're trying to get to. So I don't know if Julie wants to add any more, but I just thought I'd step in from a plan maintenance point of view.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. I think suffice to say that the conversations are ongoing, and certainly in our conversations with school leaders, it is an area that we're constantly trying to revisit. And again, just having the funding that I've talked about from the DFE and the opportunity to top slice that at a local level, I think is just another platform for us to be able to have those ongoing conversations with school leaders. Just in relation to the information that I've shared today, I did prepare a presentation, so I'll be very happy just to send that out, perhaps via the chair, if that would be helpful.
Thank you. Yes, that would be helpful. Did you want to come back on any of that, Councillor Trustwell? Okay, so Councillor Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to ask about what we're teaching the children, because when children are given information about climate change and that kind of thing, how much are they told about the costs involved? Because you mentioned the climate action route map. Nothing in this life is free. So they've got very fertile minds and they absorb all this stuff about the climate and nature and ecology, and all this is good. But there's another side to it, isn't there? The cost, and how much are they told about that, taught about that?
I think certainly in my conversations with school leaders across the city, I think with the try to have as much of a holistic conversation with children as possible. I think any conversation that we try to have with children around climate emergency, has got to include the sort of point that you've made. I think what I would say is there's something about it's getting the balance as well between allowing the children and the young people to direct the conversation. And I suppose it goes back to the voice and influence point about what's concerning them, what's impacting on their mental health. But I think we've got a responsibility across the city in terms of education. And so when we're talking education, we need to have that holistic picture. So I'm confident that within the programmes that we've got within the city, that the cost, the financial impact, is one that we will be discussing. And I suppose in some ways, the uniform scheme perhaps is a little bit of an example of that, where it spans not only the climate emergency, the needs to reduce waste, but it does impact on poverty, actually, and obviously, addresses the fact that we do have many children and many families who are currently really struggling with poverty and struggling with the financial aspect of life, at their own micro level. But then, like I said, there's opportunities to talk about that in terms of the macro level. So I don't have absolute detail of every programme and how, finance is covered, but I have absolute confidence that those holistic conversations will be going on.
Thank you. Did you want to come back on that? Anybody else wanting to come in with any questions or comments? Okay, so can I finish with a few of my own then, Julie, please? So first one is about the youth summits, that I am a reasonably newly appointed children's champion for our area, and as such I made a point of visiting as many of the youth summits as I could, just to find out and do some learning for the one that I later delivered. And it did strike me that in the sessions where the councillors were asked questions by the young people, I don't think I was at a single youth summit, people might be able to correct me, but where climate wasn't raised as an issue. So it is absolutely at the forefront of our young people's minds. And so I really welcome your comments on youth summits and the work that's going on in schools. And when I ran my youth summit, I did invite the sustainability team to have a stall, which went down really well, and they were raising the toolkit. So I think something for us all to think about are ways that we can all publicise that. It is a great toolkit, and awareness, I think, is really important. So it's an observation really rather than a question, but to use the youth summits, to use community committees, to use ways of getting that message across that it's there and it's there for young people to use. And then that kind of, well, child-friendly Leeds wishes kind of links in with that. So I won't make any comments on that one. And then the other one really was the uniform exchange. You know, if there's anything that we can do to support the rollout of that, please let us know. Because I think that's hugely important. And as you say, it addresses poverty, it addresses climate change. And I think it is, certainly from my experience, reducing the stigma of people using secondhand uniform. So it's two comments really rather than questions.
Thank you. I'm happy to respond to both. I think it gives me pleasure, but it also gives me real reassurance that actually in the refresh of the children and young people's wishes, but also in the refresh of the children and young people's plan, which is the strategy essentially for how we're going to respond to the needs of children and families across the city, that we do now have the climate emergency in there. I think it's absolutely right and proper that we do, but I think it's a really key message to the children and young people of the city that they have been listened to and that they have been able to have a direct influence and impact on those really strategic pieces of work. In terms of the uniform exchange, I couldn't agree more with you. And I think not only has it reduced the stigma, I think it's actually made it, for an old-fashioned word, I'm showing my age, but made it cool, you know, made it a good thing, actually a positive thing for children really to be, you know, looking at how they can have that, how they can support it, how they can benefit from it, but also how they can support it. And again, for me, it goes back to the point about enabling young people to have a sense of control. So I will absolutely take that away and look to see how perhaps people could be more involved.
Thank you. Thank you for attending, and thank you for agreeing to send a presentation around. You are free to go. Thank you. Okay, so that brings us on to item 10, which is over to you, Polly.
So I'm not planning to do a full-blown presentation because the report's actually been around quite a while and it's been through scrutiny and had a 2-hour discussion. But I just thought I'll give a really quick sort of flavour and overview. So ultimately, we do the annual report every year, the clue's in the title, and it focuses really on how the council's performing, but also how the city's performing. So it's our way of capturing the data and just having almost an audit trail. So I suppose some of the key things I'd pull out is this year, from when we declared a climate emergency to now, we're looking at, as a council, a reduction of about 37% in our carbon emissions from an energy perspective. And the other area that we look at, so we often talk here about the grants that we bring in and, you know, the sort of fairly impressive numbers around. So over sort of 3 years, we brought in about 100 million. And when we start to look on an annual basis, it is around about 35 million a year. And that's sort of the forward plan at the moment. However, one thing I think I have tried to bring out in the report, although that figure's great and, you know, we're obviously really proud of what we've achieved through that, it is a drop in the ocean in terms of what we need in terms of delivering net zero. So one of the key focuses really for this year and going forward is actually how do we move beyond grant. Grant plays a role, and like I talked about earlier, how it helps us when we're in with new technologies where they're starting to bed in. But actually, how do we start to engage with different financial markets and financial products? And we worked last year with Lloyds Bank. We're going to continue that work. And we're also working with people at the GFI and looking at products such as property linked finance to see how we help those that can afford to invest into their own homes, to provide routes for them to do that more easily and to make it more effective. So one of the things we've tried to bring out in the report is actually, there are lots of successes and things, but actually there are some changes we need to see. And we always talk about the fact, as a city, we can make commitments and promises, but actually we don't operate in a vacuum. And we are dependent on what others do, and we are dependent on national policy as well. And the way that we deal with that, we don't sit back, we're not complacent, but we try to work with central government, we try to influence, we try to work with other organisations such as UK 100 or LGA, and try to really encourage some of that change. But things like the transition from national gas, or the direction that we take as a country on things like hydrogen, how we get the grid to net zero, how we remove fossil fuels from transport, they aren't questions that as a city we can solve, but we can influence and we can be part of that discussion, and that's the role that we try to play. And again, that's I suppose what we've tried to bring out in the report. In terms of the recommendations, the report has the net zero housing plan that starts to set out our sort of 6 key areas where we want to work. So things like zoning, the planning framework, the retrofit hub, and the financial mechanisms that I've already talked about. We're also doing work this year about how we engage. So actually, it's all very well developing products, but actually if we go out to our residents and start to talk about them and they're absolutely not interested, then there's no point. So actually we're doing that work in a really cohesive way, and have secured funding to also support that engagement work. The recommendations also talk about the food strategy, which Councillor Anderson has kindly already covered for me, and how we've done that consultation and how we've updated the food strategy to reflect what people are saying back to us. And really now we're moving into that delivery phase about how we start to implement that. We also have committed to be a signatory to the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Committee action pledge, which lots of other local authorities are doing. And again, I suppose it's for us, it's not really committing to anything that we aren't already doing, but what it is showing is that we recognise our role within the region, and actually we've got a role to cooperate and work as effectively as we can. And then the last recommendation is really, I suppose, we secured our A grade in the Carbon Disclosure Project, which we're again really proud of. And we report on that every year. And so what we've recommended is actually that we move our annual reporting to September next year, so that all ties together and that we can bring our application to that again, and it kind of streamlines all our data capture and reporting, just trying to make it as efficient as possible. So I'll leave it there. It doesn't touch on kind of half of what's in the report, but it gives a bit of a flavour without spending too long listening to me.
Thank you, Polly. And you're absolutely right. It is a really, really comprehensive report, and I'm assuming everybody's read it, but it makes for a really great summary of everything that we're doing as a city, and it contains an awful lot more than the things you've touched on. So feel free to ask any questions about anything that Polly's talked about, but also anything that's contained in the report that Polly hasn't mentioned. Councillor Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. I seem to be the only one who ever talked about the money here. But on page 18, what are the resource implications? It says there are no direct resource implications as a result of this report. Well, no, because it's all from the government. There's £100 million being given since 2019, which is an enormous sum of money. And on the next paragraph to this, it says much of this funding will have to be provided by the private sector. this is in order to get significantly more funding. And given the chair's remarks just a few minutes ago about the difficulties that the private sector is going through and not being able to match fund and that kind of thing, much of this funding will have to be provided by the private sector. Well, do they know that? That's an interesting one. And then on page 23, with 19.5 million on low carbon heating, 19.7 million in the following year on even more low carbon heating. And page 24, I'll come back to that in a minute. So that's the finance things. But going back to page 22, the pace of change is not currently sufficient to ensure net zero will be achieved by 2030. And private housing retrofit and transport. And I just wonder whether you could say something about that, because the 2030 seems to be now in a lot of doubt, given that the government's own target is 2050. Now, page 24, onto a different subject. There's a reference here, which I thought was quite striking. It's in reference to the number of trips made by cars into the city centre in the mornings. And it's saying that since the lockdown, the proportion of trips made by cars has gone up from a half to nearly 70%, which is an amazing statistic, really. And I appreciate some comments about that, please. And 28, 29. I think I'll leave it there for the moment, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to those, Polly?
Okay, I will do my best to try and remember, but I'm sure you'll remind me if I miss anything. So when we talk about resources in the private sector, I think we're probably talking on two slightly different streams. I think Councillor Dye was probably talking about sort of smaller companies. I'm talking about large pension funds making money accessible for investment, and they are absolutely aware. And the challenge we have at the moment isn't that there isn't finance for green investment, it's that we can't get everything to align to work. And that's what I was talking about earlier in terms of that retrofit, that we actually need to make sure we develop financial products that actually residents are interested in and will work, that we can get the products such as heat pumps at the price that's affordable, and all of that needs to start to come together, and that we've got the jobs and skills. And so we are working at the moment to try and bring those bits cohesively together. So in terms of that sort of investment, I think it has to be, I suppose what we're trying to say is it's not all going to come from grant funding. I'm not expecting the government to give me money for my own home to change my gas boiler to heat pump. That's not going to happen across the whole of the city and all our housing estate. There's going to have to be targeted government investment, but there's going to also need to be ways that other householders can access funding. People might put their own capital in, but if not, there needs to be lower cost finance products. So that was the message we were trying to get across, not that necessarily individual businesses in the way that Councillor Dye was referencing earlier. And there are challenges and there are sectors which will struggle to invest. But what we're talking about is a real whole sort of a change programme now of moving away from just a complete reliance on government grant. In terms of the net zero, I think from day one, when we made the climate emergency declaration for 2030, it's always been a direction of travel and doing everything as soon as possible, because there's always been a recognition we're working in a national context. So I don't think that's changed. I think the ambition that we're working with is still the same, that we are trying to deliver as much as we can. We're pushing others to try and support us to do that. But ultimately, as a city, we cannot stop people coming across our boundaries in diesel and petrol fuel cars if they still exist. So there's always going to be limitations on what any local area can deliver. And I suppose I'm not as close to the transport data, but what I would say is you're obviously looking at some different baselines. So although the percentage of journeys has gone up, the number of journeys as a total has gone down. And it will be a reflection at the moment of some of the struggles with some of the public transport that we're experiencing. But actually, I think if I had a transport colleague alongside me, they'd probably say if you were to look at whole numbers of journeys, there isn't an increase. And I know from my sort of air quality data, and we're not seeing an increase in emissions and things. That's going down because the journeys are going down. So it's a percentage of a different base, I would suggest, but I'd have to absolutely check that to be sure, because it's not my specialist area. So have I answered everything, or are you going to come back?
Thank you. Okay, so next one was Councillor Carlisle.
Thanks. I just wanted to thank Councillor Buckley really for his concerns about the costs of kind of taking the climate emergency seriously. But I suppose a counter question I'd have is, what if any work have we or others done in the city looking at the costs, potential costs of not taking serious action on the climate emergency and not taking action on building up resilience in our city? I appreciate obviously it's a global crisis and we can't tackle it on a purely local level, but we have lots of responsibility and lots of potential risks and exposure if we don't take it seriously. So I suppose, you know, has there been work done about the potential just financial costs, quite apart from the social and other costs, but the financial costs to us as a council and as a city if we really fail to get to grips with the climate emergency, and if we are hit by some of the potential excess kind of, you know, extreme weather, flooding, or other potential side effects of climate change?
So we haven't done that piece of work specifically in Leeds, but what I would say is that actually at a treasury level at government, they now recognise that the cost of not getting to net zero will be significantly more than getting to net zero, and that there was an acknowledgement of that. I think maybe last year, we can certainly send through the quote where they are acknowledging exactly what you're saying, and that's the reason that we work on both fronts in terms of adaptation and that climate mitigation, but we haven't gone through and said, you know, this is the cost of flooding. We have got the figures from things like the Boxing Day floods and things that we look at. And we have used that when we've been doing things like the adaptation workshops, or things like the heat wave, where it brings bits of the city to a bit of a standstill, and if that starts to get more regular. So, but we haven't done it as a cohesive piece of work yet.
Do you want to come back?
Yeah, just really briefly. I suppose I wonder, could we talk to some of our partners, possibly at the universities, and commission that, because it would just be quite an interesting thing to take to the city, just to say, look, we've done some work, we've done some scenario planning, and this is just to really bring it down to the local context to try to help to shift public imagination around the challenge before us.
We can certainly have those conversations, and we have done work with things like the Met Office and things about actually saying what the future looks like and what we're expecting. So we've got kind of the scenario. I just don't think we've gone as far in terms of the costs as yet.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Thank you, Polly. Councillor Carlisle's next.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of comments, I guess, around the report and the debate so far, and then a bit of a delve into the transport side again. I was going to come in earlier and just question Neil's point there really around that cost, but Councillor Carlisle, my almost namesake, has come in with it. I can confirm your point, Chair. As Children's Champion for the Outer West, I got asked a lot of extremely erudite and detailed questions around the climate emergency, probably some of the most difficult questions I've been asked in my tenure as a councillor so far, from 10-year-olds around the climate emergency. And it did give me some comfort that the world will be in a very good place in years to come. I guess the one point I was going to make was similar to Councillor Carlisle's on that point, that I think the young people there did seem to know the cost of doing nothing. And I think that was the real driver that many young people have, that this could be a very different world for them than the one we're used to. And I think that's why they are, why that spirit of agitation is there around the fact that we can't just carry on as we are on that. And we have to look at things like finance and the economy very differently. Otherwise, we are going to be in a very dark place for their future. I think that does need reinforcing, really, because the cost of it is something that we may have to deal with. But they're the things that, I mean, we don't expect our children to think about the cost of our family home, for instance, but we make sure it's there as much as possible for them. I don't think probably it's up to us to think about the cost of their future and what we can do for them, rather than to put that burden on the children themselves. There was a point then around the private funding, because one of the things we looked at in the economy and finance working group some time ago was around some of those measures we need to put in. And actually 2/3 of the funding that we need, or 2/3 of the things we could use funding for, are things that provide a return. So it's not that the funding is disappearing. So I take it that issue is around ensuring that there is a way for the people that fund it get access to that return, which may be, so there may be a health benefit, a climate benefit, a benefit for another service, a benefit for energy companies, for instance, a benefit for the economy overall. But at the moment, there's not necessarily that way for a private finance company to then get access to that return. It may be a return that I get as a private individual, for instance, rather than themselves, such as saving energy bills. And I think that's a real difficulty there, how you tie that up. And unfortunately, how we can make sure that finance world links up with being able to capitalize on that, because the investment will come as soon as a return is proven, and the return is proven in most cases. The transport one's that difficult one. So obviously we highlight some of that in the report. We're at the point now where patronage is still only 85% on buses, for instance, of what it was pre-pandemic, and it's not rising in any way particularly fast. And I don't think anyone believes it will get back up to 100% anytime soon. So that leaves a real struggle for buses, which I don't think are mentioned as much in the report as I would like. I am a particular fan of buses, but they are the biggest people mover we have in the city, and probably our biggest opportunity to switch people to a greener mode of transport. Certainly the most cost effective, you could say, because the infrastructure is there. It notes the mayor's fares and the work that's done to try and increase patronage. But what hasn't been noted on this really is around what the next steps are in that, and what the council's position is in terms of the work that the mayor's doing around bus reform. This is another point really where young people are showing us that the future might be okay, because young people have returned to the bus much more than many of the older generations, myself included in that. But around that point, we don't really touch on that difficulty that some of the people won't have a bus they can get on anymore, because lots of routes were cut earlier in the year. And if funding is removed later on this year, there will be lots of routes that don't exist again. Obviously, one of the moves towards that is if we look towards bus reform of some way, which is obviously with the combined authority to make a decision on that. But we don't seem to touch on that in this report, which politically, I know the administration has certainly put forward its views on that very clearly, that we would like to move towards more public control of the buses. But there's not much on what the council may do to assist further in that. And I just wondered whether that was something we could work on in the next year to come.
Thank you for those comments and questions. Do you want to come back on those, Polly?
So in terms of the funding, you're completely right that it's just trying to get everything to join up and connect so that there is a mechanism for return so people will lend money in to the system. In terms of the buses, I take your comments on board, and we'll make sure that we build that in for our report next year.
Okay, thank you. Did you want any further comments, Councillor Carlisle? Okay, so next on my list is Councillor Truswell.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Some of our colleagues have covered some of the points, but when we have this discussion about the actual costing, I almost says pounds, shillings and pence, but it's now pounds and pence. I'm reminded of Oscar Wilde's famous statement about cynics being people who know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And I think that's never been truer than with the investment that we make into climate change, decarbonisation, climate emergency, call it what we will. And it's not true that all of this money is coming from the private sector or the government, because obviously there's a major element of this, for example, relates to the housing revenue account. That is tenants' rent that they pay into a ring-fenced account and that we use for a variety of different things, including obviously some retrofitting, I think if I've read the report correctly, which will save them money as individuals. So that's another side of the coin. Invest to save. The message is quite clear. You put money in up front to save money, and that money can be saved in various ways, not just for individuals, but if we're reducing the running costs of council facilities, of which we have got a number, then that means that over time, the council taxpayer, the income taxpayer, the VAT payer is paying out less money to keep the services running that we provide for their benefit. If we invest in flood alleviation, yeah, that's money up front, but over time, we get repaid through the environmental and economic benefits of that, and we avoid the human costs, which we've seen in this city in the not too distant past of having flooding, not just in commercial premises, but in housing. So I wanted to make that point, and I won't go much longer. I had a number of, I'm hoping to get out of this meeting without a cough. I don't mean interrupting me, I mean on my own chest. And that brings me nicely, in a way, actually, to one question I wanted to raise, or one issue, which you might think is marginal and trivial, but it relates to paragraph 19 and the pressure we're under as a council to exercise our powers to improve air quality. And I was somewhat perturbed a few days ago, a week or so ago, by a piece of research which showed the impact on air quality of wood-burning stoves. Now, I suspect there are some people for whom wood-burning stoves are a necessity. I suspect they're in a minority, but for most people, they're a bit of an indulgence. And what particularly struck me was not just the impact on carbon production, but also on the particulates that are generated, some of which are so fine that they penetrate right into the depths of people's lungs and therefore exacerbate respiratory conditions. And I'm just wondering where we are as an authority in terms of picking that up as an issue, because I understand that the market is really buoyant and more wood-burning stoves are being introduced, and that there is some actual examination of this issue at government level. So, you know, it's not just me going off on one. I'm just wondering in the short term what we can do about that as an issue, rather than necessarily waiting for government, which may come up with a solution sometime never. I did have other questions, but I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you. Did you want to come back on that one, Polly?
No, it is a real issue and one we have very little powers over. So if people are using wood-burning stoves in the correct way with the correct fuel, there's very little we can do. Even if they're not, it's quite challenging, because actually how do you evidence what people are doing in their own homes if you've not got access? So I suppose the only thing we've really got is sort of that kind of comms and engagement piece, because the people who are being most badly affected by that are those actually living in the homes where they're using them. And I don't think a lot of people actually realise the impact on their own health. You know, they do have an impact in the wider environment, but nowhere near as severe as the people who've got wood-burning stoves. So I'm just going to look over to Chad to see if he wants to. Is there anything else to add, or not? Not really.
Yeah, I would. Excuse me. I would add that since this issue was discussed when the Leeds Air Quality Strategy went to Executive Board last time, and we have since reviewed all of kind of the notices that Environmental Health send out where it relates to wood burning. We have updated the council website to make clear what all the guidance is on wood burning and to bring out the health messages. So we are looking at all the different ways that we can do. You know, and potentially, maybe there are more things coming in the pipeline. And I think also you'd hopefully see a knock-on effect of some of, for example, the planning policies in the local plan update that would potentially have an impact on wood burning as well. But as Polly says, it is an area where we do have limited powers, unfortunately.
Thank you, Polly. Thank you, Chad. Did you want to come back, Councillor Trustwell?
Just coming back very quickly, I mean, the officer did raise one of the things we can do, and that's to raise awareness and keep raising awareness. And if there is an issue, because in the past, figures for air quality quite often have been poor in areas where you wouldn't have expected it to have been, where there hasn't been a traffic congestion. And I just wondered how far things like wood burning stoves, especially in outer areas, is making more of a contribution to that, and therefore giving us the basis maybe to reinforce the message that is going to government about the need to tackle this as a particular challenge.
Thank you. Did you want to come back on that, Polly?
I'm not sure that we've seen air quality in areas. So when we look at sort of NO2, which is the key thing that we measure across the city, we've not seen kind of an obvious or kind of at a higher level than you would expect, I wouldn't say, but it would be more in particulates. We measure that in less places because we've never had a compliance issue. We are doing more work about measuring particulates, so it might be that starts to show some different trends or surprising trends, and we'll certainly use that. Go on, Chad. Chad's got.
Yeah, I can just add one piece of insight to this, which is DEFRA recently published their air quality data for the country, and one thing that was interesting was the kind of trend for particulates over time, over the last since 2011, has been fairly stable, and that isn't a trend that we are seeing in Leeds, where we are continuing to see some decline in particulates over time. Now, as Polly says, we don't monitor it as extensively as we do with nitrogen dioxide, but I think it is interesting that there is some variation between the national trend and the trend that we are seeing on our monitoring data locally.
Thank you. So next on my list is Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on slightly from some of what Councillor Carlisle raised, concerns about the impact of lost bus services and large cuts to active travel funding in recent weeks on the work that we're trying to do to encourage modal shift, but also to welcome the investment in decarbonisation in schools, which we're seeing planned for several schools in our ward, which is really encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that kind of comments rather than questions? So I'll move on if that's okay. Thank you for those comments. Next on my list is Councillor Hartbrook.
2 points, if I may. One, sitting between Councillor Buckley and Councillor Carlisle, I'd like to draw their two concepts together. One of can we afford it, and Councillor Carlisle's can we afford not to do anything about climate change? And I think for me, as a Western country which has profited hugely from industrialization, and in fact as a region that drove industrialization and drove the prosperity and also the problems that come with the huge amounts of CO2 that have been released over hundreds of years, I think there's a moral expectation that as a society we should lead in terms of finding the global rectification of those issues. But I also think more positively there is an opportunity there. Within this region, we have the scientists, we have the finance, we have the thought leaders, we still have some manufacturing, and actually, there is already underway a fourth industrial revolution, a fifth industrial revolution. There is a thing underway of transforming our society, not just at a city level, not just at a country level, but at a global level. Which, let's face it, there's brass to be made. There is money to be made. Somebody out there is already making money, and as this grows, as a city, we have a fantastic opportunity and a lot of the things in place, and as a region, to prosper in this in the way that our great grandparents prospered from the first industrial revolution. So I think, morally and practically, the planet well, actually, the planet doesn't really care, but as a several billion people on the planet really need a fix. And actually, as a region, I think we could lead, and actually it could be a positive thing. So I think, going back to Councillor Buckley, I think there's more to be made than there is to be lost by really getting our teeth into this. One last point, picking up on Councillor Carlisle's point on buses, not to labour the point, but obviously, I think what I hear on the doorstep is more people are concerned around lack of buses and cost of buses. And I know it's a bit of a hot potato, but I would encourage this group to implore swift resolution to get people back the buses that they need to perform their daily functions. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. So that brings us on to Councillor Tudor.
Just a brief comment, which was not doing down at all Councillor Troswell's point about the impact of wood burners, but I know I have a friend who sells logs, and he said he thinks it's driven by people not using the gas because of the cost of gas. And the cost of gas is not the same in France or Germany as it is in this country. So it's at a national level that is driving this. And let's also consider, well, I agree with the point, the stress that people are under because of their utility bills. Although we do appreciate the discount, I think it's called. That's it.
Thank you. Councillor Bowden.
Yeah, just some comments. I was recently speaking to a head, and heads are very well aware of the impact of not doing anything, especially this year. A head had to find, I think it was £25,000 unexpectedly because of the cost of fuel. So that school is looking to retrofit. But equally, echoing Councillor Buckley's thought process of financial stability within education, I do have regrets when now teaching history. We taught about the tragic loss of life of the Black Death, but what about the gross domestic product and the impact that it had on feudal Britain? And we talk about the moral bankruptcy of Henry VIII and his taste for uxoricide. But what was the financial impact of having 6 weddings?
Thank you. Oh no, hang on, I've got Councillor. I'm moving on. We've got Councillor Newton and then Councillor Shazad.
Thanks, Chair. Just a success story to tell everybody. Just waiting. I'm just waiting. Yeah, just a success story. I don't know if everybody remembers a chap called Claudio Franco who came to present to this committee. He was a public speaker, and he was talking about EV chargers on his street, and he was from Morley. And so after the meeting, I asked one of our clerks to get me in touch with him and invited him to one of our Morley Town Council meetings, and he expressed his concerns to that committee, and he's actually now acting as an informal consultant to us on the Town Council for EV charging points, and he's even expressed his interest in getting involved in decision making, which is a success story, really. We've wanted, this is the whole point of this committee, is to get people in the community involved in the climate, and I just wanted to share that story. I've got a second point as well, by the way. I just wanted to pick up on the park and rides. The park and rides have been mentioned in this report, and my colleagues in the north of Leeds, shall we say, haven't got access to park and rides, and your bus services will be are almost peak performance of travelling into the city from that north region, but we also can rely on the park and rides in the outer south. Now, I'm sure people know that the PR1, which is Ellen Road, and PR3, which is Sturton, collects people coming from the motorway, but also collects people coming from the outer south. And Monday to Friday, from the 3rd of April, bus services are going to be cut from 6:30 onwards in the evening. and have been completely withdrawn on a Saturday and Sunday at Ellen Road. And at Sturton, I think the last service will be 7:30 as well. Now, those people coming from the outer south regions have been heavily impacted on the City Square closure and the Armley Gyratory closure as well. Well, not closure, but works. And I have seen with my own eyes, yes, I appreciate that the patronage of buses has decreased and we haven't seen pre-pandemic levels yet. But I'll be interested to see the data on the park and rides, because I've seen with my own eyes the amount of parking spaces that are unavailable in Ellen Road Park and Ride. And that tells me that people have chosen to get on those buses rather than sit in traffic coming into the city centre, which is what we need. But then for services to be cut almost sort of just after the City Square closure is disappointing, really. And I think, you know, it says in the report that it's a pillar of this strategy, and I agree. And but yeah, that's all I wanted to say, really. I just think it's, you know, we're just passing comment, really, that I think it's really important that we don't forget those in the outer south region. And it's disappointing to see that they've been cut, but hopefully we can see some sort of data in the next report, really, some sort of data. You know, appreciate it's not recovered from pre-pandemic levels, but just in those communities that serve the park and ride, has there been an increase? Has there been a decrease? Is the justification really for more services in the park and ride? But anyway, I just thought I'd let members ponder on that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the success story. Are you able to comment on any of the data questions?
No, but I can commit that we're going to get the data. It might be something we take to maybe the transport working group. So I can certainly do that.
Did you want to come on this one, Carl? Says Councillor Carhill.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think that problem around buses is something that warrants a big conversation around anyway, because yeah, the services that everyone would like to use, operators are informing us aren't making enough money and aren't getting enough bums on seats to keep them running. Now that is a really big issue going forward, and none of us want to see any of the buses cut. The funding of them is the really difficult one. How do you make up from those bums missing on seats? In terms of the park and ride, slightly different because that's under contract, but in terms of public services, they are run by private operators and the data is theirs, and we have to ask them for that data. It is against competition law necessarily for us to be sharing data of one service and their passengers. But I think it would be great to ask the private operators to come and discuss this. We've done it in the scrutiny boards, but that's the real difficulty, I think, of the nub of it. How do we deal with that gap between where we were with that amount of passenger income to then dropping down? And how do we deal with it under the current financial system where they are a private service run by a private provider, and they can choose to remove a service when they wish? The local authority, well, the transport authority, I should say, which would be the combined authority in this, can step in where it can, but doesn't have finite amounts of money. And the more services that are lost, obviously, the less money there is to bring it back. So I think it's a really good one for debate, certainly with the transport working group, but I think it probably warrants this committee looking at, because the climate jury had a very strong point around public transport that they wanted us to consider. And that was public ownership and return of public control to bus services, really.
Thank you. I think they're two really important recommendations that we should look to do as we move on, to bring it for a discussion at the working group where we can get into it in more depth. And then we can look at it as a main SEAC after that. Thank you for raising that. Okay, so Councillor Shazad.
Thank you, Chair, and I welcome the report and all the hard work done by Polly Cook trying to put in this report together. But a couple of issues that I have, or maybe there might just be comments, is first of all, we're looking at making this inclusive for the whole of the city, for everyone. Are we taking everybody on board? It's one of those things that I mentioned from the very first SEAC, which is nearly now 2 years ago. I just don't feel like we're taking all the communities on board. It seems to be certain communities that are probably already on that agenda and taking it forward, but are we actually going out to the other communities? Because we have got different communities in different wards, but I don't really see any presentations or anything coming from them. Are we actually engaging those communities? Maybe as chair of one of the community subgroups, am I failing there as well? Or are we failing at the whole SEAC? Then on top of that, are we looking at the inner areas, because that's where the impact, again, if they're having reduced bus service, where does all the congestion actually come up to? It actually comes in to the inner areas which are close to the city centre. Okay, we're making it pedestrianised, we are closing City Square and trying to improve the environment there, but what we doing to the environment that are the inner city areas, i.e. you'd have Holbeck, Hunslet, you'd have Bermondsey, you'd have Gipton Harehill will come into that, Chapeltown will come into that, Little London and Woodhouse. Are we looking at what impact all these changes are having on those communities, and how we going to improve the air quality for them? Because it's all okay having good air quality to breathe in the city centre, but those people at most risk at the lower end, the most deprived residents of Leeds, what we're doing to their air quality, and are we looking into that? And again, like I said, are we involving all the communities? That's something that report does not really mention, even though it does mention we want to have inclusive growth, we want to have green jobs, but there's a lot of communities that could probably benefit from these green jobs because they're in very low paid jobs. But are we actually reaching out to them to say to them, there's an opportunity in the green sector, can you do you want to get upskilled, or do you want to learn some new skills? So I'd say, I think somewhere along the line we are still missing out communities. We probably not getting through to them, or either we have to look at ways of actually speaking to those communities and getting that message across. And because I've not seen one group so far in SEAC that has been diverse enough to that's even come to the open forum. We've not really had much diversity, and this is the second year running. So I think there must be something that as the SEAC committee and maybe the subgroups we're not reaching out to. So that's point number one. And point number two, obviously chairing the business and community subgroup, again, the finance issue is a big issue, because when it comes to small and medium firms, that's fine. But a lot of this match funding, like for example, in my ward, we have a lot of independent sole trader or just joint partnership coffee shops or other sorts of businesses that struggle to survive, especially with this cost of living crisis. So it's something we really need to look at. How can we expect a firm that's probably got a profit of, say, £5,000, but we're telling them to invest in a scheme where they're going to have to give you £5,000 up front to go get a efficient boiler? I know they will get payback, but it's that upfront payment that they have to make to actually get going. And there is commitment, because obviously Greenwood is a group that I am regularly attend and part of. The commitment from individual businesses is there, but the smaller businesses are the ones that are struggling to make that commitment further, because as soon as they see the grant application, they have to match fund it with 50% upfront. They just can't afford it. A match funding of that size would probably take them under, to be honest. I know it'll raise efficiencies, and then we have to realise a lot of the onus is on the landlords, because a lot of these independent shops actually do not own the premises that they live in. So we have to work out how we can bring it to everybody, and how we could make this something that's appealing to everyone, not just to, say, medium-sized or large businesses who can probably afford it and get the tax cutbacks and stuff where it's beneficial to them. But an individual or a partnership will struggle to actually match fund and go ahead on this very important issue that they want to actually be part of, but we can't make them part of it because of the funding structure. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So before I bring Polly in to comment on anything that you'd like to comment on, Polly, I think the diversity issue you raise is a really important one, and I think that needs to be something that we can take as SEAC looking forward in terms of open forum representation, in terms of going out to community committees, which we've already talked about today. and I will take that on board as an action. And your comments about businesses, we talked at great length about the difficulties at the last working group, and we have committed to taking forward that debate as well and looking at how we can make that easier. So I think 2 really important points raised there. I don't know if you want to come in.
I'm not going to say too much about engagement at the minute because Chad's going to follow me with a presentation on some of the work we have done around engagement. I suppose what I would say is we do some really targeted work. So where we've, for example, got funding that we're distributing, that is really targeted comms. So rather than press releases and the rest of it, we will look at actually the communities where that funding can help the most, which will be those where levels of deprivation are the highest and things, and we will really work within those communities. But I won't steal Chad's thunder, so I'll stop there. In terms of the congestion point, you're right in the sense that it will be getting worse. We are not seeing a trend of worsening air quality anywhere though in the city. So it provides some comfort in those areas. Everywhere is on a downward trend. And obviously we monitor that. We do an annual report on air quality performance. So the only other thing I'd just say about the businesses, there is something called the minimum energy efficiency standards that's coming in for landlords. So that will mean that if you're renting business properties, they have to be of a certain standard, which then does take the burden away from the small business owner. They may see it through increased rents because they'll be funding it back, but in a way that will then make it more affordable and get away from this upfront cost. And that's the reason I suppose that policy has been brought in. So I'll just add that in as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to close this item. I think we've had a really wide-ranging discussion, and almost everybody has had something to say. So I think that really speaks to the depth of the report, Polly, and I think we're really appreciative as a committee for all the immense amount of work clearly that's gone into that. And thank you very much. So let's pass on to item 11, which is over to you, Chad.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to share my screen, so just bear with me one moment, and I've got a quick presentation to go through, and then I'll take questions. So just to introduce myself again, I'm Chad Newton, Senior Policy and Communications Officer from the Sustainable Energy and Air Quality team. As already been kind of addressed, we're the team that kind of takes responsibility for kind of coordinating the city's climate, for the council's climate action, and comms works in a similar way, in that we have relations with and good working relations with colleagues across the council, but we don't necessarily lead on every single aspect. So the following slides cover a mix of projects and work that we've done, but also we'll reference some other work of others as well. So I think a really good place to start is kind of answering the question in terms of why it's important. And when we did the Big Leeds climate conversation in 2019, which followed the declaration of the climate emergency, a really clear finding that came back to us was like there was widespread support for ambitious climate action. But one thing that was kind of regularly said to us was that people didn't know where to start. And they also wanted to see leadership from governments and businesses. And I think when we're talking about the Big Leeds climate conversation, it's also worth pointing out that a lot of effort went to kind of make sure that what we heard was representative. We did go, as well as having the online consultation, we also did go to lots of community events. So whether they were kind of community fun days, whether that was Carnival, Pride, we went to lots of events across the city, but the message was kind of consistent, no matter who we were asking, is that it is a priority, people don't know where to start, and they wanted to see leadership. So I think that's an important point to make, and I'll come back to that kind of later on in the presentation. So what is the role of council climate communications? I think the best way of setting out is kind of the 3 E's on this slide. So firstly, there is a really important role for communications to be used as a means of implementing policy and to make sure that that schemes, for example, are delivered successfully. And this is particularly important, I think, There's been some discussion earlier about the funding that the council has secured from government. A lot of that funding is time limited. So communications has a really important role to make sure that we're getting the maximum impact from that funding, because often they're kind of the funding is given to us in kind of use it or lose it fashion. So, for example, we did a lot of work in 2022 to make sure that low-income homeowners in some of the coldest homes across the city were aware of and applied for the Better Homes Yorkshire retrofit funding. So we had around 3,000 applications as a result of that communications and engagement work that we did, and 900. More than 900 households passed the eligibility checks and were able to benefit from that scheme. So, so a lot of the work that we do in communications is around that, whether that is the retrofit schemes or whether that is EV trials. It's about making sure that when we set out to do something, that we get a good take up from the city, so that it actually does have the maximal impact. Because there isn't as much point in launching a scheme if nobody actually knows about it and uses it. Secondly, a really key role of communications and engagement is actually explaining the council's climate-related policy and action. And a really good example of this, which is pictured, is the Leeds food strategy, which we launched last year, which we consulted on towards the end of last year. And my team had an active role in making sure that that was an accessible strategy. Councillor Anderson's already talked about how we've made it even more accessible since then. But this is one of the first council strategies that I've seen where we took a digital first approach, where we put it online so that if you have visual impairments or you need to use translation software, it is all it is accessible to you still. It meets the minimum public sector accessibility regulation standards. That isn't to say that we didn't also do lots of work in the community, and our partners at Foodwise did a number of face-to-face engagement sessions with people to promote the consultation and talk people through the strategy. But actually being accessible and making the council's work more accessible and explaining what we're doing and why we're doing it is really, really important. And so a lot of the work that we do also kind of comes into that bracket. And then thirdly, we also do a lot of engagement work. And this is a two-way street. So by engagement, I mean making sure that people understand what they can do, whether they're a business or an individual, and what they can do in terms of climate action, but also making sure that we as a council are engaging with the city and using that engagement to inform our policy. And so a lot of the work that myself and my team have done is actually supporting other departments across the council where there is a climate link, for example, planning or the food strategy, and making sure that we are kind of amplifying the opportunities that for people to have their say, and so that can then inform council policy. One final thing I want to say on engagement, which I very nearly forgot, was as well as engaging the city, we're also working to engage internally as well, to make sure that council services understand what they can do in terms of both climate mitigation, ending our contribution to climate change, but also climate adaptation. And so pictured there is a workshop that we held in December, where more than 70 council officers with risk management or severe weather responsibilities attended to learn more about the future impacts of climate change on our region, and then begin to think through the kind of actions that they can then implement in their business continuity plans, for example, to better protect their services and their service users from some of the impacts of climate change. A lot of the work that we do, as Polly has already said, is done kind of scheme by scheme, program by program, because that recognises that actually the way that you, for example, get someone to switch to an electric vehicle is different to the kind of way that you might persuade them to eat a healthier and more climate-friendly diet. So we have to take everything in a targeted and kind of scheme-specific way, but we do have some kind of overarching climate-related activities going on, which this slide sets out. So in 2022, there were kind of 68 press releases issued by by the council that relate to climate action in some way. We've also got our monthly newsletter, which has a growing subscriber base, which I'll come to on a later slide. We publish it every month apart from April because of PERDA. We had a role, and Councillor Dye has already made reference to this in terms of supporting community events, attending community events, to make sure that we are kind of using those as an opportunity to promote some of the council's schemes, and also some of the resources like the Young Person's Toolkit or the Leeds by Example website that people can make use of. We also host events. So last year we hosted a kind of breakthrough medical conference for health professionals to begin to engage health professionals in terms of the risks from air quality across the whole life course, and what they can do as health professionals to engage some of their patients, to really start a conversation which we feel needs to be happening in conjunction with our teams in public health. We also have a role in kind of supporting the work of Climate Action Leeds, which does really good work across the city with hubs across the city. Our team has seconded 1 day a week of support to that initiative. And then finally, as well, it's also made a reference earlier on in this committee meeting, but there has been 4 meetings of the Community and Business Engagement Working Group, which have looked at a range of issues affecting both individual and also businesses in terms of engagement. When I highlighted the conclusion from the Big Leeds climate conversation, one of the key things that I pulled out of that was the fact that people wanted to know where they could start. And we do have quite a lot of resources available. So we have the Leeds by Example website, which breaks down, kind of summarizes all the actions that individuals can take to reduce their impact on the environment, down into 5 themes, whether that's food, buildings, stuff, travel, and wildlife. And we also have the Clean Air website as well, which does something similar for air quality. So on the council website, leeds.gov.uk/clean air, not only have we got advice in terms of what individuals can do to protect themselves from air pollution, but also in terms of what they can do to reduce their own emissions. And every time that we do anything related to air quality, we'll promote this, and we'll often promote the Leeds by Example website as well. The other thing I should say about the Leeds by Example website is we keep updating it regularly, we keep maintaining it, and we want it to be a tool for the city. And we do know, for example, that Climate Action Leeds signpost to it, and it has been used by kind of other partners as well, as a kind of trustworthy tool that that someone else is updating, and so that's part of our role as well. The impact of some of the work that I've mentioned in previous slides is we are reaching out to people by securing kind of media coverage. So late last year, there was a fantastic piece on the district heating network on BBC Look North, for example. Some of our retrofit work has been featured in ITV News, and we regularly, receive coverage of our press releases and of the work that we're doing, which means that we can reach a much bigger audience than anything that we can do actually through our own channels, and it also comes through a trusted source. I mentioned that the climate newsletter is published monthly. At the start of February in 2021, it had kind of 5,800 subscribers, and that's now gone up by 1,100 over the course of a year and continues to grow. I've already mentioned some of the other statistics on this page in terms of the number of applications we received for the Better Homes Yorkshire scheme, and that we engaged more than 70 council officers. So this just gives an example, I guess, of some of the impact of that work. But as I say, most of the work that we do actually occurs in kind of a scheme by scheme, a more targeted approach. Another reason why explaining the council's policy is important is to get the recognition that for the council's work. And why that is important is it's not only good in and of itself, but it also gives us opportunities in terms of influencing policy, in terms of getting access to decision makers at kind of a national and international level. And Polly and members of the executive board have regularly had meetings as a result of Leeds being recognised as a leader in some of our climate work. And that recognition is best encapsulated in the CDP A grade rating that we secured last year. And so finally then, before we move on to questions, I just wanted to touch on, I guess, some of the priorities for the year ahead. So Leeds Pipes is something that, a £49 million district heating network, which is delivering affordable, reliable and low carbon heat to homes and commercial buildings across the city centre. There is still lots of scope for growth. So one of our priorities this year will be supporting that and trying to attract new customers, new commercial customers to boost the impact and the carbon saving impact of the district heating network, and also enable us to reinvest the money from that into expanding it further and helping more homes. So there's loads of work going on in terms of that, and there'll be a new website and more marketing on Leeds Pipes later on in the year. We also plan to launch a new retrofit scheme. So similar to the Better Homes Yorkshire scheme, the communications have a really important role in enabling the successful uptake of that. I've already mentioned in terms of some of the work that we're doing to explain our policies, but I think there's more that we can do to kind of highlight how they all link together in an accessible way. So like how we've done for food and some of the other parts of our kind of policy agenda, how do we talk about all of the climate action that the city and the council is doing in a way that the public actually understand, so that they're in a better place to engage with us and we're being more transparent. Fourthly, the food strategy was approved by Executive Board last week. Within that, in the sustainability and resilience section, where was an action related to kind of raising awareness of environmentally friendly food choices, and we've got opportunities to do that at our venues, as well as through our own kind of communications channels. So I think that you'll start to see some of that work later on in the year as well. I've already mentioned the work in terms of supporting colleagues across the council, and there's great work being done in terms of transport, in terms of planning, and we'll also be working with employment and skills, with public health, and actually supporting Leeds 2023 to put sustainability on its agenda as well throughout the year. We will continue to explain how the council is continuing to lead by example in climate action, and we'll continue to engage services across the council in terms of what more they can do to implement adaptation and boost climate literacy across the organisation as well. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad. That was really interesting and covered an awful lot of things that are going on. Thank you so much for taking the time to put that together for us. Anybody want to come in with any questions? I've got Councillor Hartbrook first.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Chad, and thank you for the high quality of communication that comes out from the council. It is very much appreciated and yeah, consistent, detailed, and kind of quite authoritative. One thing I was going to suggest that we might want to do, and I'm almost wary of bringing this up, but I'm seeing more of it on social media, is that whenever there is communication of the kind of societal change that we are moving towards, you get actors out there that are either misguided, mischievous, or malevolent, who spread untruths, rumours, myths out there, which people get sucked into and people start believing, and people end up picking up the wrong facet of what it's about. 15-minute neighbourhoods being one that seems to be filling up a lot of my social media at the moment, whereas to me it's just about being able to get to a doctor's a bit, walking, rather than being kind of geo-tagged and followed by a satellite, which seems to be what some actors would have you believe. But irrespective, not to belittle it, people believe, there's a saying, isn't there, that a lie's halfway around the world before the truth's got its pants on. And I think as a city, I wonder whether to some extent we need to tell people what we're not about as much as what we are about, because that will help dispel some of those myths before they kind of gain traction.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that, Chad?
Yeah, thank you for the comments, Councillor. I think that's a really, really interesting point. I think it's a very salient point. I myself have seen some of the myths that you're talking about. I think a question that it raises, though, is what is the best way of countering some of that misinformation? And there is quite a lot of evidence which shows that sometimes repeating a myth actually makes it stick more, particularly if it comes from an authoritative source. So I think, and I don't have a solution off the top of my head, but I think what we need to make sure that we are doing is not necessarily rebutting some of the false information, but pre-butting. So how do we make sure that we're explaining what the council's policy is before it gets to the point where there are lots of myths being made? Now, I appreciate that doesn't necessarily help in terms of the 15-minute neighbourhood example, but I think that kind of reaffirms the value of having that explanatory function to council communications. And I do think, we do an awful lot. There is always room for improvement in terms of actually not only being able to explain it in an accessible way, but in making sure that across the city, it is penetrating people's kind of filter bubbles. We all live in our own kind of algorithmically influenced worlds. And it can be really, really hard to kind of penetrate those to actually make sure that even if we do come up with a fantastic explanation of what we're doing, that actually reaches people. And I think that comes back to how can we work with partners? How do we earn coverage in the media that would be trusted? And those kind of stakeholder networks, and how can we use those to get to access people? Because that is the hardest part about communications, is that a lot of people are not, people are not all listening to the same channels as maybe they were in 50 years ago. They're all living in their own bubbles, and it's how can we actually access those in a persuasive way before, as you say, mistruths get halfway around the world.
Thank you. Did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly you get it, and I like the idea of pre-buttal, and it's your point around reinforcing by repeating is the reason why I specifically didn't, because it sounds like we're on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Carlile.
Thanks, Chair. It follows on quite well from the last point, really, which was obviously there's a lot of conversation with different services to support them around what they're doing, but quite often it's those services themselves that are the best at putting messaging out to the people that use them. So I think the waste service is quite good in terms of the Leeds Recycle Twitter account, for instance, and things like that, giving you handy tips. But I don't know how good we are at, for instance, having something that goes out through housing channels that gives people useful information, all the other various angles that we could look at. Is there anything that brings that together? Because obviously the climate emergency is a core policy and strategy of the council. All the separate departments do quite rightly have their bit to play in what they do for the council, but they have their bit to play in how they communicate to residents as well, and things that impact on their service or whatever customer facing service it is that department's providing.
To come back on that.
Yeah, I think there are, I guess, two approaches to kind of doing this. And I think you're right in that we are fortunate to have a lot of kind of communications assets that we can build on in the council. And there is a lot of good work being done by officers across the council in terms of engagement. But yeah, I think the two solutions. I think firstly, it's around making, it's actually not a communications point. It's around a policy point in terms of making sure that the waste strategy, the housing strategy, the transport strategy, all have climate change and the climate emergency on reflected within its own strategies, so that by default the work being done by these departments is kind of getting us in the right direction. And I think we have, I think actually we're in a fortunate place in that, the strategies I've just mentioned are generally supportive of the climate emergency. Well, not of the climate emergency, of responding to the climate emergency. But then I think secondly, I think ultimately it's a point around kind of coordination and making sure that as officers, we're all in dialogue, we're all in discussion. I would never seek to duplicate the work of the waste team, for example. So what we will then do is amplify that. But for example, in the last month, it's been Food Waste Action Week. And the waste team did communications via their channels, but then we were able to kind of amplify that and put something on the council's LinkedIn, for example, to reach a business audience in terms of some new resources that are available. So whether it's kind of ad hoc meetings that we have and just maintaining dialogue, or actually the role of the Communities and Business Engagement Committee are actually shining a spotlight on the different areas where communication has an important role to play. I think fortunately that is happening, and we need to make sure that that continues to happen.
Thank you. Councillor Carlisle?
Yeah, just to echo what others have said, thanks for everything you're doing, and yeah, it's great to hear. This is a comment really more than a question, and you might or might not have anything to say about it. But I was particularly struck by an event at the back end of last year where, and it's a bit of a tangent from your exact work, but I think it's a wider query about how the council communicates. There was quite a lot of furore on social media, particularly Twitter, about an event in Roundhay Park, and the allegation was that kind of wildlife had been needlessly destroyed by an outside commercial operator who came into Roundhay Park to do an event. And there was kind of this thing was unfolding on social media about how appropriate is it for the council to lease out its park spaces and and I was struck that the council and councillors indeed were just silent. There was no response from the council. This thing was unfolding. It was getting retweeted. It was like people just piling in, and I had a bit of a conversation with council officers off the back of that, and the response, and I'm not trying to do anyone down, but the response was along the lines of, well, there wasn't a request for any kind of comment. There wasn't a kind of, nobody from the press contacted us, and almost like there was no request for us to comment and respond to this. And I was like, my response to that was, well, there's this whole thing unfolding, and it's getting a lot of attention, and it's needless because actually, some of the stuff that was responded to me privately on email was saying, no, whilst I'm sure it could have been better, it wasn't as kind of destructive, and it wasn't so much wanton destruction going on as perhaps appeared to be the case. So I suppose what I would like is the council more generally, not just about climate, but perhaps climate's a good example, to just think how we can be more nimble, how we can be more responsive, how we can maybe even be more creative and playful and human on social media, as opposed to just being this monolithic beast in the city that just speaks to the city. But almost, sometimes you'll see, and maybe it is easier for corporations more than councils, but I think sometimes you'll see some quite big organizations being quite nimble and funny and quite human and interesting and engaging on social media. And I just wonder if the council could do a bit more of that. And maybe just because the climate emergency is such a big deal, maybe we should just really kind of go for broke and test out with our climate communications.
Sorry, Chad, did you want to come back on those points?
Yeah, I think it raises some really interesting questions. It's certainly something that, as a communications officer, we have to think a lot about kind of what is the right tone for council communications and the council's kind of identity on social media. I do think you're right in that I think some corporations can sometimes have more of a license to have a bit more fun than a local government authority. But having said that, there are some councils, and Doncaster is a fantastic example, which is able to do that. But then also you've got to make sure you consider the tone of, the issue at hand at the same time. And, I can see potentially some people being critical of us, they may perceive, something more jovial, in the context of talking about the climate emergency as being inappropriate. So yeah, I think that's something that for me to go away and consider in terms of if are we getting the tone right, and is there something that we can do to improve? in terms of the responding to particular issues, I think because I'm loosely aware of the example that you gave, but I think one consideration that is made by officers is also by the time that a proper response is, by the time you've found out all the facts and you've responded to people directly, is it going to actually help matters to be proactive in issuing that kind of rebuttal, or actually is it going to highlight and risk spreading kind of mistruths potentially? Because we have to use our, be really, really careful about how we use our platform, and particularly from the big kind of main social media accounts, which do have a very big reach. So I think there's a balance to be struck between what is the best way of tackling well, if it's misinformation, tackling that, if it's questions, kind of answering that, whilst also being careful not to risk kind of doing more harm than good. So that is, I think, the balance that has to be struck. But I think going back to the previous question as well, I think ultimately we need to do a better, we do need to make sure that council officers across the council are engaged with the climate emergency and understand that these things that must be considered, and actually these must be communicated at the same time. And actually, hopefully, the more that we can do that going forward, the fewer situations where we have to issue a kind of rebuttal or answer questions, fewer of those situations will occur.
Thank you. Did you want to respond?
Yeah, just really quickly. So thanks for that. I suppose, I wonder if the council might just want the comms team within the council might just want to even come up with a bit of a system whereby if a particular social media thing goes over a certain threshold, then we have to respond. If one person is just sending out a load of tweets every day, then that if it's not at a particular scale, then I don't think we're obliged to. But something like that was getting a lot of attention. It seems mad that we weren't responding. And with regards to kind of gathering the facts, I think there's just maybe something about saying, somebody responding saying, thanks for raising these concerns, we're looking into it and we will issue a response. At least people don't just feel like they're just shouting at the council and just not getting anything at all. And so it shows that we're being, I suppose, dialogic and responsive. And then with regards to, I suppose the persona that the council are trying to present on social media, which is, absolutely correct. Part of me thinks, if this really is a climate emergency, then maybe it's just my personality, but I'd say let's just take some risks within reason, without going crazy. Let's just try to see what we can do on social media to, as a council, enter into that conversation and have a fuller conversation with the city about that. And we might get it wrong on occasions. We might upset some people as we do that. But if it's a climate emergency, then what have we got to lose? We need to really engage. We need to really dive in. We need to get involved.
Thank you. So I've got two people wanting to speak. It's 3:20 and I'm wanting to finish on time. So can we be relatively brief? Councillor Bowden first.
It's just addressing what Ed was talking about the event last year, because it wasn't just a council situation. It was Friends of Roundhay Park as well, who, there was accusations about what was happening with the private company. And then because it's an action of a private company, we're then trying to find out as much information about the actions of a private company. So there was obviously difficulties there. And ultimately it was just there's miscommunication. Well, not even miscommunication. It was just untruthful what people were saying. And so I guess there was just a little bit of a time frame issue in regards to actually putting out what was actually going on. So that's it. But it wasn't just a council thing, because obviously Roundhay Park has its own governance, the Friends of Roundhay Park.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Newton.
Thanks. I think the big issue is education and educating people about it. And I'm heavily involved in a lot of the youth summits in the Outer South community region. And what we hear from primary school children and secondary school children, they're all aware of what's going on in terms of climate. And, it might be important for you guys to engage in the Outer South community. I'm not saying that you're not doing, but it's one of the things that you could do in terms of the youth summits that we hold. I know we held a really big one in Morley Town Hall just recently, and about 11 or 12 primary schools came and talked them through the Outer South Community Committee, the wellbeing funds, the HAP funds, etc. And I think it'd be nice to have the climate as a bit of the agenda to that. And then the second point, in terms of educating school children, I think there's a big gap in educating the young professionals that we have in Leeds City Centre. And well, this is my view, but I think the young professionals have a large carbon footprint, whether it's having avocados in their salads or driving to work or having a meal deal out of fridges that are uncovered in Tesco and Boots, for instance. And, since lockdown, a lot of people have come out of university and have gone into the world of work in Leeds City Centre, and a lot of business networking opportunities like Leeds Young Professionals, where Tom Reardon has been a guest speaker there, and Let's Market and the After Work Club and the Leeds Junior Lawyers Division. These are all well-attended events. And I think that the climate guys can sort of have a little stall or set up or give a talk. And I think it's about educating those people as well. And that we reach out to them people, because they're, at the end of the day, they could be our shareholders and directors of tomorrow who can make decisions in terms of companies. So yeah, it's just a comment really.
Thank you. Did you want to respond to that, Chad?
Yeah, I'll respond quickly. In terms of the youth summits, the approach this year has been to essentially help out anyone that asked us to do that for the youth summit. But I think going forward, and this was one of the actions of the community and business engagement working group, was to be more proactive in terms of supporting the youth summits to talk about climate change and promote the toolkit, for example. So yes, we'll definitely take that away, and if that's an invite to one in the south of Leeds, then we'll take that. In terms of the young professionals and the avocado on toast comment, one thing that we do want to do, and I mentioned earlier, was in terms of raise awareness of environmentally friendly foods and environmentally friendly diets, which may include, discussing whether or not avocados are bad for the environment or not. And if there are more events like that, please just make us aware of them. And if we can get it in, and if we've got the resource to attend them, and it's seen as kind of supporting our objectives, and engaging people in food is one of them, then we will do our best to attend those.
Thank you. And can I just echo that point, that I invited Chad's team to come to the Youth Summit that I was part of organising, and it went down really, really well. So I just encourage you all to put that invitation out to any opportunities. Right, Councillor Hartbrook has promised me he's going to keep it in 1 minute. So let's see, shall we?
No pressure, no repetition or deviation. Just picking up on Councillor Carlisle's point around tone, and I think by all means try new things. It's always welcome. I actually quite welcome the fact that the tone is quite, I'll say vanilla, in that it's not judgmental, it's more informative. And I think whenever you get a challenging issue in a community, I actually think it's for the councillors to take on the tone of voice as to how to communicate it and how to deal with it. So therefore, I quite welcome clear, concise, factual communications from the council, because actually the views across the city amongst the councillors are diverse. That's why we have an electoral system. So I quite welcome that. And looping us back to the very beginning of this meeting, the commitment group asked people to vote for the councillors who take environmental or other issues that are pertinent to them seriously. So I think by the council comms team putting out the facts, it's up to councillors to kind of explain the narrative in their style, and the electorate judge that in their own way.
Thank you. Just to add a couple of comments of my own, Chad, I really appreciate that there's a wide variety of different channels and different ways of communicating with people, because I think that's the way to spread the message out. I think one of your successes as well, which hasn't been mentioned, was the council tax communication has a climate message in it as well, which I think is really, really impressive. So I think we need to carry on making those links with anything that's going out, really, and just being able to share it. And then just to pick up on one of the priorities that you mentioned on your last slide, number 7, was looking at engaging internally and improving carbon literacy across the council. I think if committee members are in agreement, it would be good for us to make a recommendation that work happens, that we look to improve carbon literacy, and then people can help to spread that message. If people would be in agreement with that, can I take that as a yes? Thank you. And we can use the engagement working group to look at that, to look at how and where we prioritise and things like that. So thank you very much. Okay, so I just want to finish by saying thank you for attending in person. It's nice to end the year like that. A huge thank you to you all for being very active members of this committee. I think we've had some great conversations and really moved things on. Lots of actions have come out of lots of the things that we've done. And a huge thank you as well to all the officers who've supported this committee, because we couldn't have done it without you. We don't yet have a date and time for the next meeting. I understand from Cassie it is in the pipeline, but we're not able to share it yet. So thank you very much for attending, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.